The candles burn low, their flames shuddering in the sour air. Each flicker feels weaker than the last, fighting a darkness that doesn't belong. Outside, the city holds its breath. The fog has thickened, not drifting like mist, but moving, alive, crawling over cobblestones and through alleys like something searching for prey. It is December in Victorian London, and the fog has turned solid, an ocean of poison that seeps through window cracks and keyholes, pressing against glass with a slow, deliberate hunger. Horses stumble blind in the streets, collapsing mid-step. Men strike matches just to see their own hands, but the light is swallowed before it leaves the flame. The air itself is no longer air, it is a body, heavy and yellow, pushing into lungs until they wheeze and forget what clean feels like. Children wake in the night, coughing black. Mothers press wet cloths over their faces, praying through the taste of soot. The city's heartbeat slows a million souls, gasping in unison, one breath closer to silence. Some call it fog, others the wrath of industry. But for 5 long days in the winter of 1852, London would come to know it by another name, the Great Smog. It will paralyze trains, drown the church bells, and turn the Thames into a mirror of death. Bodies will vanish before they hit the ground, swallowed by the haze, their footsteps fading like whispers in smoke. If you're listening now, stay close, don't open a window, don't take a deep breath. Just listen and hope the air around you is still your own. Because in this story, every breath matters. Today, we go back to the moment when the world's greatest city choked on its own progress. The Great Smog, London's air plague, that choked the city to death. The mornings in Victorian London never began with light. They began with a kind of shadow that moved, a pale, brown film that settled on rooftops and chimneys before most eyes had opened. The city woke beneath it, stretching and coughing, as though the act of breathing itself had become an effort. From the riverbanks to the rooftops of Mayfair, soot was as ordinary as the sound of carriage wheels. The air had weight, the kind that clung to your coat and filled your throat with the taste of ash. People spoke of weather, but in London, the sky was something man-made, a ceiling of smoke built brick by brick, chimney by chimney. At dawn, milkmen's cries echoed through streets where sunlight rarely reached. The glow from the gas lamps shimmered weakly through fog so thick it turned the world into smudged watercolor. Shopkeepers swept soot from their doorsteps before displaying their wares, knowing it would return before noon. In Whitechapel, mothers tied scarves over their children's mouths before sending them into the streets, hoping cloth might do what the heavens would not filter the filth. The wealthy, safe behind their curtained drawing rooms, burned coal of a finer kind, softer and less foul. But even they could not escape the faint sourness that crept beneath doors and through keyholes. It was progress, they said, the price of empire. The railways needed fuel, the factories needed power, the lamps that lit the night ran on the same coal that darkened the day. And so London grew louder, busier, wealthier, and harder to breathe. Each puff from a chimney stack joined 1,000 others until the city became a living engine, turning human breath into fuel and smoke into silence. The poor burned what they could find, soft bituminous coal that smoked thick and heavy. It was cheap, and it kept them alive through winter, even as it quietly began to kill them. Children coughed themselves to sleep in cold rooms. Street sweepers rose before dawn to clear horse manure slick with soot and rain. The Thames itself ran black, carrying away the refuse of a city that had begun to drown in its own creation. And yet, to the Victorians, it was a mark of pride. The haze was not filth, but industry proof that London was the heart of the modern world. Few saw it for what it truly was, a warning. The smoke was not just the smell of work, it was the first whisper of an unseen sickness, a slow tightening around the city's throat. Londoners joked that the fog made everything romantic, that lovers could kiss unseen in the gloom. But beneath the laughter was a wheeze, a sound that would soon echo from hospital wards to palaces. The Great Smog was not yet here, but the city had already drawn its first poisoned breath. Every hearth in London was a small act of defiance against the cold. Winter crept in early and lingered long, seeping through the brick and mortar of the city until bones ached with dampness. Fire was comfort, fire was survival, and coal was the heart of that fire. To live in London was to breathe what you burned. The poor knew it best. They bought their coal in broken lumps, sold cheap from wagons that clattered through the alleys at dawn, shouting prices no one could truly afford. Their chimneys belched thick smoke that turned the rooftops a permanent grey. Each night, the same ritual. The strike of a match, the first crackle of flame, the familiar curl of black that rose and joined the millions above. For the wealthy, the story was gentler but no cleaner. Their fires burned softer coal, smokeless by comparison, perfumed with a hint of civility. But even in the great houses of Kensington and Bloomsbury, the windows filmed over with grime. Servants scrubbed sills daily, though. Their hands could never quite keep pace with the sky. The city was a furnace, its heart beating beneath cobblestones. Factories by the river worked day and night, feeding the empire's hunger for steel, for cloth, for power. Smoke poured from every stack, rolling low over the city like a tide. The soot did not care for class or title. It settled equally on palaces and prisons. Inside the cramped tenements, the fires burned almost constantly. The stoves were small iron beasts that devoured coal and coughed smoke through crooked flues. Curtains yellowed within weeks, lungs within years. Mothers watched their children sleep by the glow of dying embers, unaware that the same warmth keeping them alive was stealing breath from their future. On the streets, chimney sweeps thin, blackened boys with hollow eyes climbed through flues no man could fit, scraping soot for pennies and coughing blood before the year was out. The smell of coal hung over everything, in bread, in hair, even in the rain. A fine black dust gathered on teacups and picture frames, the residue of countless fires burning in unison. Doctors called it soot disease, a polite term for lungs collapsing under the weight of progress. Men spat black into handkerchiefs and laughed it off, saying it meant they worked hard. Women hung linens indoors to dry, only to find them dirtied again before morning. Londoners learned to live with it, to breathe through scarves and carry on. But the air was changing. It grew thicker each year, heavy as wool. The wind could no longer carry it away. The sky itself had begun to trap it, folding the city into a blanket of its own exhalation. The warmth that once meant comfort had turned to dependence. The fires could not be put out without freezing the people who fed them, and so London burned, endlessly, hungrily, a city keeping itself alive one breath at a time, even as every breath grew shorter. The Thames was never truly clean, not in living memory, but by the mid-19th century, it had become something else entirely, a mirror of the heavens above, reflecting not clouds but smoke. The water ran thick with soot and refuse, its surface sluggish and dark, carrying away the city's sins in silence. Each tide brought back the same filth it had carried out the day before. Barges moved through the murk like ghosts, their outlines blurred by the mist, the air around them heavy with the scent of tar, rot, and ash. From Westminster to the docks, the river no longer sparkled, it smouldered. At sunrise, the fog rose off the water in greasy swirls. Fishermen could no longer see their own nets. The gulls flew lower now, circling sluggishly, their wings grey instead of white. In the mornings, the sound of the oars striking the surface echoed through the haze like distant bells. But even those who had worked the Thames all their lives began to notice its change. The river, no longer, carried the cold bite of morning air. It was warm, strangely warm, as if the city itself had begun to fever. Along the embankments, factory chimneys leaned over the water, exhaling clouds that blended with the river's breath, until one could not tell where air ended and water began. The banks were lined with the residue of labor, coal dust, cinders, dead rats, the occasional horse carcass thrown in when no one was looking. The river had become a graveyard for things that no longer had use. Still, it moved on, as all rivers do, indifferent to what it bore. To those living near its edge, the Thames was both blessing and curse. Washerwomen bent over its oily surface, their aprons darkened beyond saving. Children played in its shadow, tossing stones into water that never rippled clean. The smell of sulphur and damp clung to every breath. And yet, every evening, Londoners still walked its bridges, drawn by habit to the river that both fed and poisoned them. Lovers whispered on the parapets beneath a sky the same color as the water below, grey upon grey, as if the world had forgotten how to end the night. The poets still tried to make it beautiful. They wrote of mists and melancholy, of reflections shimmering in candlelight. But those who rode upon it, those who hauled goods or emptied waste into its depths, knew the truth. The river was dying. It coughed, like the people who lived beside it, slow, weary, and unending. In the years to come, when the Great Smog would settle over London and choke its streets, the Thames would lie motionless beneath the weight of it all. Witness to centuries of empire and industry, it had long ago accepted its role as London's shadow, a dark, breathing thing that mirrored the sky not because it wished to, but because it had no other choice. The Victorians loved invention. They built their future out of iron and fire, convinced that smoke was the scent of progress. In the foundries of Southwark and the workshops of Whitechapel, the air shimmered with heat and ambition. Each new machine promised to make life faster, brighter, easier, but behind every spinning gear and hammering piston, another invention took shape, one no one could see, though everyone was breathing it. It rose from every chimney and engine, from every hearth and gaslight, an invisible empire of poison spreading quietly through the streets. Coal was its architect. London burned more of it than any city on earth. Trains thundered through the outskirts, trailing plumes so vast they blotted out the sky. In the center, factory stacks punctured the skyline like black needles, knitting together a blanket of soot that thickened with every winter. Engineers spoke proudly of efficiency of engines that wasted nothing, but in truth, everything was wasted: the air, the water, the lungs of those who lived too near. The soot crept into pores, into bread, into dreams. It coated every brick and window until the whole city looked like it had been dipped in ink. Doctors began to notice strange patterns. Men who never smoked coughed like chimney sweeps. Children born healthy grew pale and breathless by 10. The term fog chest entered medical journals, a polite phrase for lungs stiff with soot. Yet no one spoke of regulation or reform. The idea that the very source of prosperity could also be its poison was too dangerous to admit. Factories fed families, and families fed the fires. The circle was perfect, and perfectly deadly. On cold evenings, the city glowed orange. Gaslights burned through the haze like candle flames trapped in bottles. The glow was beautiful, soft, romantic, deceptive. Lovers met under the lamplight, oblivious to the thin dust that drifted between their lips with each breath. Painters came to London to capture it, mystery, the fog that turned corners into whispers. They called it atmospheric. Poets called it divine. But for those who lived and labored beneath it, the beauty was a lie. Behind the brushstrokes and verses was the simple truth of suffocation. By the 1850s, invisible death had become London's constant companion. The fogs grew thicker each year, the coughs deeper. When rain fell, it carried soot down the gutters in black rivulets, staining the hems of women's skirts and the cuffs of gentlemen's coats. No one thought to call it disaster. They called it weather. They had forgotten what clean air felt like. Somewhere deep inside the factories, amid the hiss of steam and the clatter of gears, a new kind of silence was being forged, the silence of a city too proud to listen to its own dying breath. London was inventing not just machines, but its own undoing. The air was no longer empty. It was alive, alive with progress, and progress had learned how to kill quietly. It began quietly, the way all slow deaths do. A chill in the lungs, a cough that lingered longer than it should, A faint sting in the eyes when the morning fog rolled through the alleys of Limehouse and Clerkenwell. Londoners called it pea soup, a nickname meant to soften the truth. The air had grown thicker, its colour more unnatural, a murky yellow-green that clung to walls and clothes like wet wool. But no one stopped to wonder why. It was London, after all. The fog had always been here, only now it had teeth. Children were the first to feel it. They coughed in classrooms, their voices wheezing through lessons about empire and arithmetic. Nurses wiped soot from their foreheads and said it was only the season changing. The truth was harder. The air was no longer air at all. It was smoke diluted with mist, a mixture of sulfur dioxide, tar, and dust that turned breath into labor. At dawn, when the first fires were lit, the streets filled with a low, steady hum, the city, inhaling its own exhaust. Horses strained under the weight of their loads, their nostrils flaring as they searched for oxygen that wasn't there. The sound of hooves on cobblestone grew muffled, absorbed by the fog's heavy body. In the marketplaces, traders' cries were swallowed mid-sentence, voices dissolving into the haze. Even the bells of Street Mary Le Beau lost their distance. They seemed to ring from just a few paces away, the air itself too dense to carry their song. By midday, the city glowed the color of tarnished brass. Street lamps burned long before dusk, their halos reduced to small circles of trembling gold. People walked with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, not out of fear but habit. The fog had personality now. It curled around legs, seeped into carriages, and lingered in hair. Newspapers wrote of its beauty, of how the world looked like a dream, though the dream was the kind that woke one coughing in the night. Doctors began to whisper. At Street Bartholomew's, the wards filled with men who could not stop wheezing. The elderly, the infants, the poor who worked closest to the factories they came first. The physicians called it winter bronchitis, but even the name sounded tired, as if language itself had grown short of breath. The undertakers, though, did not question. Their orders rose with each new fog. By evening, the smell of sulfur clung to the streets like a warning. It sank into bread, into beer, into skin. When the rain came, it fell black acidic, biting at the edges of umbrellas, staining paper and lace alike. Still, the people of London went on as they always had, trudging through the haze with bowed heads and steady steps. The human body, they said, could endure anything, but endurance is a slow surrender. The first breath of poison had already been taken, and no one yet knew that they were breathing history, that each inhale was a countdown, and the clock had already begun to tick toward the smog that would bring the city to its knees. By the winter of 1852, London had forgotten what blue looked like. The sky was a constant bruise, sometimes grey, sometimes ochre, and sometimes the deep yellow of an old bruise gone wrong. It hung low over the city, pressing against rooftops, swallowing church spires, and dimming even the proud glow of Westminster's gaslights. People began calling it the Yellow Curtain, part joke, part resignation. It fell without warning, folding the city in half. One moment you could see a row of shops, the next the world ended 3 feet from your nose. When the curtain came down, Londoners learned to navigate by memory. The lamplighters worked early, their poles tapping blindly at the lamps overhead. Horses stopped where they stood, snorting into the haze, waiting for orders that couldn't be shouted far enough to reach them. Men stumbled into gutters they couldn't see. Women walked arm in arm, counting steps between doorways to find their way home. The fog was no longer background, it had become the city itself, a living creature with its own mood. The smell was the worst of it. It wasn't just damp or soot. It was sour, chemical, and strangely sweet, like rotting fruit mixed with fire. People said it tasted of metal. The fog slid down throats and into lungs, coating the inside of the body with grime. When people coughed, the sputum that left their lips was black. But life went on. Theatres opened their doors, carriages rolled through the murk. The gas companies sold more light than ever before, though most of it vanished a few inches from the flame. Business thrived in blindness. In the East End, mothers wiped soot from their infants' faces until the cloths turned grey. The babies coughed, tiny bodies shaking with the effort, while their fathers shoveled coal into stoves that made the air worse. They called it necessity. Warmth first, breath second. In Westminster, the members of Parliament debated sewage and tariffs while the smog coiled around in the windows of the House like an audience waiting for a confession. Some joked that even God couldn't see London anymore. When the wind changed, the curtain moved. It drifted south toward the river, swallowing bridges and warehouses whole. Sailors moored their ships and refused to move until it passed. On the docks, cranes swung blind, guided only by shouts that vanished into the murk. The fog blurred the line between day and night. People lost count of the hours. In some quarters, the gaslights burned for days without pause, halos glowing dimly against a darkness that refused to lift. The curtain had settled in for good. It was not a visitor, but a resident, a tenant of London's soul. Every breath drawn beneath it was a small act of surrender, every exhale a gift back to the thing that had made it. The yellow fog no longer needed to hide its presence. It had claimed the city, and the city, weary and proud, had begun to love its captor. London was ruled not by monarchs or ministers, but by coal. Every brick of the city owed its warmth, its noise, its light to that black, glittering stone. It powered the empire's railways, its factories, its kitchens, its parlours. It was cheap, plentiful, and trusted the quiet sovereign of the age. No one questioned its dominion, because no one could live without it. The poor burned the soft, smoky kind bituminous coal that belched thick yellow clouds into the air. The rich bought the harder anthracite, finer but still foul, and every flake of soot, whether from Mayfair or Whitechapel, joined together to form the same grey kingdom overhead. The coal king, as newspapers like to call the industry, was untouchable. His throne was built on profit, his crown forged from smoke. Railway barons and mining magnates sat beside him, fat with dividends and influence. In Parliament, they spoke of prosperity and progress, of Britain's destiny as the workshop of the world. When the subject of the air came up, they smiled and said, "It is the smell of success." Few dared disagree. Coal kept the hearths burning and the machines running. Without it, there would be darkness and hunger. Better a sooty sky, they reasoned, than an empty stomach. But beneath the grandeur, London was suffocating. Chimneys multiplied like weeds, sprouting from every rooftop. In some districts, one could count 50 in a single view. The dawn light that filtered through them came tinted and weak, a dull orange glow that promised no warmth. In working-class neighborhoods, smoke never left the air. Women scrubbed their windows each morning, only to find them blackened again by noon. Laundry hung indoors, pale sheets turning grey within days. The people lived in a snowstorm of ash that never melted. Children worked in the coal yards, their faces permanently dark, their lungs older than their years. Chimney sweeps climbed flues still hot from the morning fire, scraping soot with bleeding hands. When they coughed, it sounded like gravel. The doctors called it soot-wort, when the black dust beneath their skin turned to tumours. Still, the coal king demanded labour, and London obeyed. Every strike of the match, every shovel of ash into a furnace, was another genuflection to him. By evening, the city glowed with the light of its own imprisonment. Gas lamps burned through the haze, and people said the night looked beautiful like a painting. But beauty can be a kind of blindness. The glow was not romance, it was combustion. The very air was alight, carrying invisible embers that scratched the throat and dimmed the mind. The city had built an empire on smoke, and now worshipped it like incense. In the halls of Parliament, the coal king's allies raised their glasses to the progress of Britain. Outside, the people raised their scarves over their mouths and kept walking through the fog. No one noticed that the smoke was no longer rising. It was settling lower each year, as though preparing to take its throne upon the streets themselves. The reign of coal was absolute, and the air had begun to kneel. By the middle of the 19th century, London had become a laboratory of sickness. The air itself was an experiment gone wrong, invisible, omnipresent, and inescapable. Doctors carried the evidence not in test tubes but in their patients' lungs. When they cut open the dead, the organs were no longer pink but marbled grey, their surfaces slick with soot that refused to wash away. It was as though the city had found a way to write its name inside the body. In the wards of Street Thomases and Guys, the coughing never stopped. Rows of beds filled with men from the factories and docks, women from the laundries, children from the workhouses. They all came with the same sound, a low, rattling wheeze, like wind through broken shutters. Physicians called it smoke suffocation, then fog fever, then chronic bronchitis. But each name was just another way of avoiding the truth. Londoners were dying from the air they breathed. The city itself had become contagious. The doctors tried to track the symptoms, but the fog made liars of their instruments. Thermometers clouded over, candles sputtered out before examinations could finish. In the clinics of the East End, a diagnosis could be guessed from the color of the phlegm. Yellow meant infection, black meant hopeless. Children brought in by their mothers were often blue-lipped before dawn. One physician described them as breathing dust instead of life. Another, a young surgeon named George Burkitt, kept a jar of soot collected from a patient's lungs to show his students what the human body was enduring. He called it a specimen of progress. Among the wealthy, illness took on a different name. It was not fog fever, but nervous exhaustion. Society women fainted in drawing rooms thick with coal smoke, their corsets blamed for the weakness. Gentlemen developed mysterious coughs they attributed to damp weather or too much brandy. In truth, no window or title could buy clean air. The fog seeped through velvet curtains and into parlors lined with gold. It did not care for rank. Outside the hospitals, the street vendors sold tonics and lozenges promising to strengthen the lungs against city air. They were mixtures of honey, alcohol, and opium relief disguised as remedy. Clergymen preached that the haze was a divine trial, sent to humble the proud. Scientists, when pressed, gave measured replies. Yes, the air was worsening. Yes, deaths were rising. But coal was necessary. The factories must run. The empire must trade. And so, the doctors wrote their reports, sent them to Parliament, and waited for silence in return. Their findings were catalogued, debated, then buried beneath new statistics. Medicine had diagnosed the city's disease but was forbidden to name the cause aloud. In the absence of cure, they treated symptoms: a poultice for the chest, a draught for the cough, a prayer for the dying. London did not want healing, it wanted denial, wrapped in smoke and progress. And in that haze of good intentions, the Great Smog was already stirring, patient and unseen, preparing to test whether a city could live without breath. The fog arrived without warning one November evening, folding itself through the city like a thief. It crept first through the alleys of Wapping, then across the river, curling around the bridges and whispering through the arches. By the time it reached Fleet Street, it had grown heavy enough to blot out the lamps one by one. The watchmen lit them as always, but their glow lasted only a few heartbeats before the fog swallowed them whole. The city, for the first time in living memory, began to lose its light. At first, Londoners treated it as spectacle. They leaned from windows and laughed at the strangeness of it all. The air shimmered like honey, dense and golden, soft to the eye but rough to the lungs. Children tried to catch the fog in their hands, giggling until the coughing began. Street performers vanished mid-song, their music muffled into silence. In taverns, the regulars made jokes about the end of days, but even the drunkest among them paused when they noticed the windows, glowing faintly, as if the air outside had turned liquid and alive. By midnight, the lamps along the Strand had dimmed to dull orbs, visible only at arm's length. Carriages collided at corners. Horses refused to move, trembling as their handlers struck them with sticks. The drivers shouted to one another, their voices swallowed mid-air. The city's familiar noises, the clip of hooves, the shouts of vendors, the hum of crowds faded into a strange, thick silence. It wasn't quiet in the ordinary sense. It was suffocating, like sound itself had been smothered under cloth. Inside the houses, people lit candles and drew curtains tight. The flame burned blue, then green, flickering as the air thinned. Even indoors, the fog found its way in, squeezing through keyholes and window seams. It filled attics and stairwells, sank into carpets, and lay over sleeping faces like a damp shroud. In the poorer quarters, the gas lamps sputtered out completely. Mothers sat up all night beside coughing children, afraid to strike another match in air that could barely support the flame. By morning, London had vanished. The sun rose somewhere beyond the haze, unseen and powerless. People stepped outside and found their own hands invisible before them. The city had become an ocean of yellow-grey, depthless and still. Men tied handkerchiefs around their mouths and led one another through the streets by touch. The Thames disappeared, its smell the only reminder of its presence. Even the great dome of Street Paul's was gone, swallowed like everything else. From every quarter came the same refrain whispered through muffled scarves. Where have the lights gone? The lamplighters, unable to see their own ladders, gave up their posts and stumbled home. The lanterns were still there, burning bravely against the void, but their glow could no longer pierce the thickness of the air. The fog had won its first battle. The lanterns of London, once the city's pride and symbol of pie, civilization had been reduced to ghosts. And somewhere in that suffocating darkness, London began to realize that light, like breath, could be taken for granted only until it disappeared. Dawn came, but no one noticed. The clocks declared morning, yet the world outside remained as black as midnight. Londoners woke to silence and an air so thick it pressed against the skin like wet cloth. Windows glowed faintly yellow from the trapped gaslight inside, giving each house the appearance of a lantern sinking under water. The sun had not risen. It was there, somewhere beyond the soot and sulphur, but its light could no longer reach the ground. For the first time in memory, London lived a day without day. Milkmen stumbled through streets they could not see, calling into the dark and hearing their voices thrown back by the fog. Horses balked, refusing to move forward, their hooves clattering nervously on cobblestones slick with soot. The gas lamps burned endlessly, their flames trembling in the poisoned air. Workers groped their way to the factories by touch, following the sound of machines rather than the sight of chimneys. Shops opened into nothingness. Carriages rolled forward and vanished a few yards later, their drivers guided only by memory. From the river came the sound of horns, not warnings, but pleas. Barges drifted blind into bridges, their pilots unable to tell water from land. The fog had fused with the smoke of 10,000 chimneys, turning the air into something living, something hostile. It moved in slow waves, carrying the smell of coal and rot, of metal and decay. When people spoke, they could see their own words, little puffs of vapor, hanging in front of their mouths before being swallowed by the murk. In Whitehall, clerks arrived late, faces grey, papers damp and curling in their hands. Inside Parliament, lamps burned day and night, but even there, the haze found a way in. Members coughed through their debates, their words echoing dully in rooms without sunlight. Some laughed, calling it a fog of democracy. Others sat in silence, rubbing their eyes, too weary to find humor in it. The smog had erased distinction. Rich and poor, politician and beggar alike, all were simply bodies in the dark. As noon approached, it grew darker still. Candles burned on breakfast tables, street vendors carried lanterns at their hips, women shopping in the markets stumbled into one another, murmuring apologies to unseen faces. A strange quiet settled the quiet of confusion, of fear that dared not name itself. Somewhere, a church bell tried to ring, but its sound was muffled, reduced to a heartbeat. Even the birds had gone silent. By evening, the city was suffocating. Chimneys continued to burn, feeding the very fog that had devoured the light. People peered upward, hoping for a break in the sky, a glimmer of blue. None came. The heavens had sealed themselves shut. London had become a cavern, its roof made of smoke. That night the papers described it politely. Unusual atmospheric conditions continue, but in the homes of the poor, in the wards of the hospitals, and in the hearts of those who knew better, the truth had already formed. Like frost on the glass, the sun had not merely hidden, it had abandoned them, and the city, for the first time, understood what it meant to live without forgiveness. The city learned to move without seeing. By the second day of the Great Fog, London had become a maze of half-heard sounds and guessed directions. People learned to read footsteps instead of faces, the rhythm of boots against wet cobblestone guiding them like a code. Horses were led by rope, one behind another, their bodies vanishing into the yellow-grey wall a few feet ahead. Policemen tied handkerchiefs around their mouths and carried lanterns that glowed like dying embers, barely strong enough to illuminate their own hands. The gaslight, once a proud symbol of modernity, now served only to show how dark the air had become. The fog was not uniform. It shifted like thought, thick in some places, whisper-thin in others. One street might appear passable, while the next vanished entirely, swallowed whole. From above, if anyone could have seen it, London would have looked like an island drifting beneath a toxic sea, only the faintest glow of lamps marking its edges. But no sky was visible. The fog reached even the rooftops, coating chimneys in oily residue and dripping black rain down the eaves. Each droplet carried the taste of coal, of metal, of something faintly acidic that burned the tongue. Inside the homes of the poor, darkness reigned at noon. Curtains no longer mattered. Even with lamps lit, the rooms looked underwater, faces dim as shadows on parchment. Children played quietly by instinct, their laughter subdued, as though sound itself might anger the fog. The smell of it, sharp, chemical, and faintly sweet, hung over everything. Food tasted of smoke, tea brewed grey, and even bread, when broken, released a faint scent of ash. In wealthier homes, servants went about their work with scarves tied tight, cleaning soot that settled again before the day was done. No one could escape it. The darkness was democratic. Outside, London's landmarks were gone. The clock face of Big Ben was invisible. Its chimes echoed through the murk, disembodied and directionless. Carriages overturned in the streets. Men fell into the river without warning, their bodies found days later, bloated and blackened. Shopkeepers left their doors ajar, calling into the void for customers who would never find them. Even thieves gave up, not out of conscience, but confusion. The city was no longer theirs to navigate. There was something unnerving about it, a feeling that London itself was dissolving. People began to whisper that the fog was alive, that it listened, that it learned. A woman swore she had seen it curl around her door like a hand. Another claimed it breathed with her, inhaling when she did. The priests called it judgment. The doctors called it weather. But to those who lived beneath it, there was no difference anymore. And through it all, the shadows grew thicker. Not the ordinary kind cast by light, but a living absence, the kind that swallowed voices and erased outlines. London had become a city not of stone or steel, but of silhouettes, millions of moving ghosts, each searching for a shape, for a street, for a sun that had forgotten them. The fog had not just hidden the city, it had rewritten it. It happened sometime near dawn, though dawn no longer meant light. The fog had thickened through the night, and the river's edge had disappeared. The Thames, once loud with the calls of boatmen and gulls, lay still and invisible, a graveyard of echoes. Along the embankment, a carter tried to guide his horse through the murk, the wagon creaking behind him under a load of coal. He could hear water, but could not see it, could not even see the animal at the end of his reins. He spoke softly to calm it, his voice trembling in the silence. Then, with one more step, the sound of hooves stopped. There was a splash, a scream, and then nothing, only the hiss of the fog closing in. The story spread quickly. A horse had walked straight into the Thames, blind as its master, swallowed without a trace. People said it was an omen, that even the beasts could no longer tell earth from water, safety from ruin. But in truth, it was no accident. The river had vanished from sight days before. Its smell was the only warning, left a sour, metallic reek of decay and waste. Men who had worked its banks for years now lost their bearings and stumbled into the depths beside their cargo. The water carried them away quietly, folding their cries into the fog. By the third day, the city had lost its sense of place entirely. Street corners that once felt familiar became traps. People reached out for lampposts and caught only air. Bridges materialized out of nowhere, ghostly silhouettes suspended over nothing. Barges drifted without pilots, scraping blindly against the banks. The river police tried to patrol, their lanterns faint as stars seen through smoke, but soon they, too, stopped. There was no point in searching. The Thames was no longer a river, it was an extension of the fog, a dark artery pulsing beneath the city's skin. Those who lived along the water grew restless. Fishermen, unable to see their own nets, stayed indoors, their boats moored in the shallows. At night, they heard strange sounds, the splash of unseen bodies, the creak of oars that never reached the dock, the echo of voices calling names that went unanswered. Some swore the fog moved with intention, that it thickened when they approached the shore as if to hide what it had taken. In the taverns, men told stories of the horse that had vanished. They said its eyes glowed in the depths now, watching, waiting for the next soul to step too close. Mothers warned their children not to wander near the embankment, whispering that the fog was hungry. The superstition spread faster than the truth. The smog was not just killing, it was claiming. When the river finally revealed itself days later, the tide receded to show what it had hidden. Horses, carts, and men lay tangled in the mud, their outlines soft beneath a new layer of soot. Londoners stood on the banks, staring into the dark water, each of them understanding, though none dared to say it aloud, that the city had begun to devour its own. By the fourth day of the fog, breathing had become an occupation. Every inhalation was measured, shallow, deliberate, as if the air itself had turned against its people. The hospitals were full. Nurses wiped black soot from the mouths of the dying, their linens streaked with grime no water could wash away. The city was sick, and its lungs were failing. London had become one great patient, sprawling and gasping beneath a shroud of yellow smoke. At St. Thomas's, the corridors echoed with the sound of coughing, dry at first, then wet, then guttural. The wards were dim, the gas lamps hissing through the haze that had crept indoors despite the shutters. Doctors moved like ghosts between the beds, faces wrapped in cloth, hands blackened with soot. They had run out of remedies. Mustard plasters, camphor rubs, and hot poultices had lost their power. The air was poison, and every attempt to treat it only stirred more dust. Children wheezed beside their mothers. The old lay still, their breaths shallow and uncertain. The sound of life itself had become labored. In the East End, where homes were packed tight and chimneys never rested, the fog gathered thickest. Coal smoke from the hearths mingled with the city's own exhalations, forming clouds so dense that candles barely burned. Families sat awake at night, coughing into rags, waiting for the first faint glow of dawn that never came. Infants grew feverish in their cradles. Some mothers opened windows, praying for wind, only to let in more death. The soot settled on everything, the bread, the tea, the skin. It coated the inside of lungs the same way it blackened the wallpaper. The factories kept running. Their owners could not afford silence. The wheels turned slower now, creaking under the weight of damp, polluted air. Workers stumbled through the haze like sleepwalkers, wiping tears from eyes that stung constantly. The foremen carried lanterns through the rows of machines, their outlines blurring in the gloom. Every whistle that signaled the end of a shift sounded like a sigh of relief. Outside, the streets were no better, the same choking air, the same blind wandering from home to work and back again, a city trapped in its own rhythm of survival. Reports began to circulate. Hundreds were dead, they said, then thousands. The numbers grew too quickly to print. Hospitals requested more beds, more blankets, more air that could not be supplied. The Prime Minister remained silent. Newspapers called it unseasonable weather, refusing to admit that London's own furnaces had caused the calamity. But the people knew. They could feel it in every rasping breath, every ache behind the ribs. The city was collapsing from the inside out, its great iron lungs clogged beyond repair. And yet, even in suffocation, life continued. Milk was delivered, church bells rang faintly in the haze. Somewhere, a baby cried. London did not fall all at once, it simply slowed, each heartbeat heavier than the last, each breath a negotiation. The fog had conquered the city, not by violence, but by patience. It waited, thick and unhurried, for the final exhale. It began to be called by a new name now, the air plague. The newspapers had run out of euphemisms. Thick weather and unusual fog no longer fit a crisis that was killing by the hour. There was no storm, no enemy, no war, yet the death toll climbed as if there had been all three. Doctors spoke of lungs collapsing under invisible weight, of hearts laboring in rhythm with the poisoned sky. The city was being strangled slowly, and everyone could feel the hands closing. In the hospitals, wards overflowed. Cots filled the hallways, the chapel, even the stairwells. Nurses stumbled through the corridors carrying basins of blackened sputum. Patients gasped through wet cloths held to their mouths, desperate for air that did not exist. The stench was unbearable, a mix of coal, sweat, blood, and sickness. When the doctors cut into bodies, they found lungs that looked burned, streaked with soot, as if the victims had swallowed fire. The air outside was the culprit, but inside it was no better. Candles flickered, dimmed, and died in the wards, the oxygen too thin to feed even a flame. Outside, the streets resembled a battlefield. People lay where they had fallen in doorways, on the steps of churches, beside the wheels of carriages that had stopped moving. Some wandered aimlessly, coughing until their legs gave out. Others knelt in the road, praying aloud for wind. The fog paid no mind. It drifted on, slow and deliberate, wrapping itself around buildings like a living thing. It filled basements and climbed staircases. The Thames ran silent beneath it, carrying corpses to the sea. In Whitechapel, families sealed themselves indoors. They stuffed rags under doors, covered vents, and prayed that their candles would hold. The air inside turned sour within hours. Infants suffocated in their mothers' arms. The elderly died sitting upright in chairs, too tired to stand. When undertakers came to collect the dead, their black coats turned grey before they reached the next street. They could not keep up. Bodies piled in churchyards until even the priests stopped counting. The city's machines went quiet, one by one. Trains halted, the engines too choked to run. The omnibuses stood still, horses collapsing beside them with foam around their mouths. Theatres shuttered their doors, their stages hidden behind curtains of smoke. Even the bells fell silent. Sound could not travel through air so heavy. The world had become muffled, as though London existed underwater. In Parliament, a few men argued through coughs about whether to issue a public warning. They decided against it. Panic, they reasoned, was worse than poison. But panic was already here. Londoners spoke in whispers, as if afraid the fog might overhear them. It had taken on the quality of a living creature breathing, listening, hungering. The air plague had no face, no mercy, and no cure. By the end of the 5th day, the city seemed suspended between life and death. The fires still burned, the chimneys still coughed, but the people did not. London, once the beating heart of an empire, had become its own tomb, a monument built from smoke, its epitaph written in every breath no longer taken. By December's final week, London was no longer a city but a lung collapsing in slow motion. The fog had thickened into something beyond weather, a substance, a presence, a weight pressing down on rooftops and ribcages alike. Those who could still breathe did so in short, frightened bursts, afraid of inhaling too deeply. The air carried a heaviness that could not be described, only felt. The sting in the eyes, the burn in the throat, the ache in the chest that began each morning and ended only in sleep if sleep came at all. It had been nearly a week since the light disappeared. Day and night had become meaningless. People carried lamps at noon, their glow swallowed within arm's reach. The gasworks burned endlessly, feeding the fog with more fuel. Each chimney was a mouth exhaling death. Inside the homes of the poor, fires crackled faintly, their warmth a cruel comfort. Mothers crouched near them, rocking infants whose breath rattled like paper. The smoke that rose from their rateng stoves joined the great cloud outside, thickening it further, the city suffocating itself with every attempt at survival. Doctors and nurses moved through the hospitals like soldiers at the front, their faces blackened by soot, their hands raw from wiping blood and phlegm. The wards were overflowing. The dying no longer cried out, they simply wheezed until silence fell. The air in the hospitals was as foul as the streets, thick with the same poison that had driven patients there. Outside, hearse drivers worked through the night, guided only by the sound of their own coughing. Coffins were left stacked like crates, marked hastily with chalk names that would wash away in the next rain. In Westminster, the fog entered through the cracks of Parliament's old stones. The great clock at St. Stephen's could not be seen, though it continued to toll, marking hours that no one could distinguish. Ministers met behind closed doors, discussing the tragedy and the abstract meteorological irregularities. They called it, while the streets outside became rivers of black mud and fallen bodies. The Prime Minister spoke of endurance and prayer. He did not mention that his own servants had begun to die. By the fourth night, the city grew silent. The coughing stopped not from recovery, but from exhaustion. The fog hung motionless, as if waiting for the last sound to fade. When the wind finally stirred, weak and uncertain, it carried with it a sound unlike any other, not the roar of traffic or the clamor of bells, but a low moan that rose from a million throats. The sound of London trying one last time to breathe. And then, mercifully, the air began to shift. A faint current swept through the narrow lanes, tearing holes in the haze. Lamps flickered to life again, their halos visible for the first time in days. It was not victory, only reprieve, a gasp, before collapse. The smog would lift, but the damage was done. December had proven what no war or fire ever could, that London could be conquered, not by armies, but by its own breath. They said you could always find your way in London by the sound of street pauls. Its bells marked the hours of work and worship, echoing across rooftops and through the narrow veins of the city. But during the Great Smog, even that ancient voice was swallowed. For days, the bells did not ring, not because they had ceased, but because the air refused to carry their song. The city that had always been noisy, alive with the endless pulse of industry and voices, now lay mute beneath its yellow blanket. Silence had weight. You could feel it pressing against your ears, like water closing over your head. On the morning the bells vanished, the cathedral was invisible. From Ludgate Hill, you could not see its dome. It was as though London's heart had been carved out. The great grey mass of stone sat buried beneath the smog, its windows weeping with condensation, its steps slick with grime. The priests moved through the corridors with candles cupped in their hands, their flames weak and sickly. Even inside, the air was thick enough to sting. Incense had been abandoned. There was no point in adding to the suffocation. The prayers, too, grew quieter. No one could raise their voices against the fog. Outside, the streets surrounding St. Paul's resembled a battlefield after defeat. Men stumbled into one another, disoriented, their faces blackened by soot. Women clutched handkerchiefs to their mouths, their eyes red and streaming. Carriages were left abandoned in the road, wheels half submerged in black puddles. A thin film of ash lay over everything. Steps, benches, railings like the dust of a funeral that would not end. The pigeons that had once gathered on the cathedral's dome were gone, their bodies later found in gutters and wells. At noon, a verger climbed the narrow stair to the bell chamber, coughing with every step, The ropes hung still, slick with moisture, their fibers stained dark from the fog. He tugged at one experimentally. The bell moved, and a deep vibration rolled through the air, but it did not carry. It was as though the sound struck a wall a few yards away and fell dead. He tried again, harder this time, and again the noise went nowhere. The city could not hear its own heart. That night, London knelt in a silence that felt sacred and terrible. From within the cathedral, faint hymns rose, the last few voices unbroken by the coughing that dominated the city. They sang not for deliverance, but for endurance. People nearby stopped in the streets to listen, though they could not see where the music came from. For a moment, it was as if the fog itself paused to hear. When the wind finally shifted days later, the bells rang again, tentative at first, then strong. Their sound carried far, rebounding off the river, echoing through empty streets. Those who heard it wept openly. It was not the end of the smog, nor the beginning of healing, only proof that something of London still lived beneath the silence. But for those who had walked through the soundless days, that was enough. The bells of street Pauls had found their way through the dark once more, though their tone would never sound as bright again. By the fifth day, London had ceased to exist, at least, to the eye. The world had collapsed into inches. The great dome of street Paul's, the spires of Westminster, the clock face of Big Ben, the bridges strung across the Thames, all gone. Only the vaguest shapes remained, shadows of walls, glimmers of windows, lanterns glowing weakly through a thickness that felt alive. The city had not been destroyed, yet it was gone all the same, folded inward by the weight of its own breath. At first, Londoners had called it fog, then they called it smog, but now they had stopped calling it anything at all. There was no longer a word that could describe the thing that surrounded them. It was not weather, nor storm, nor night. It was a blindness that breathed, and it had erased the world. From the rooftops, which were no longer visible, the city must have looked like a pit of lightless smoke. From the streets, it was worse. Buildings appeared and disappeared as if the fog were playing tricks with time. You could walk 3 steps and vanish from view, your voice cut short in the thickness. Mothers tied ropes to their children before sending them to fetch water. Policemen worked in pairs, joined by twine-like mountaineers climbing into the unknown. Horse-drawn carriages crawled at a walking pace, the drivers shouting warnings they could not hear themselves. It was not unusual to see a man walking with his hand on a wall, feeling his way down the street as though tracing the edge of a cliff. The disappearance was not sudden but complete. Markets were empty, theatres closed, the post went undelivered, the milk unsold. The riverboats stayed moored, their pilots unwilling to risk the invisible water. Even the clocks seemed to slow, the air too heavy for time to move freely through it. Day melted into night without distinction. It became impossible to tell what hour had come, or if the hour mattered anymore. The city no longer obeyed the sun. Inside, people listened. They heard the muffled shuffle of unseen neighbors, the clink of horseshoes striking stone, the distant, disembodied toll of a bell that might have been real or imagined. The fog had become a curtain between sound and sight, leaving everyone stranded somewhere between waking and dream. Some began to whisper that London had been taken, that the city they knew had slipped sideways into another world. In the East End, an old woman stood in the doorway of her tenement, clutching a lantern whose flame barely showed. She called to her son, who had gone out that morning to buy bread. No answer came. The fog ate her voice. She waited until night, or what she believed was night, then went inside and closed the door. She never saw him again. By the time the wind finally stirred, and the first thin light broke through the haze, people blinked, like survivors emerging from a long burial. Streets reappeared, lampposts stood revealed, and London seemed to breathe again. But something had shifted. The city was there, yet different, fragile, uncertain, as though it knew it could vanish once more. London had disappeared, and in its return, it carried the memory of how easily it could be unmade. When the fog became too thick for sight, London's constables turned to touch. They began tying themselves together with lengths of rope, knots fastened tight around their waists like mountaineers crossing a glacier. It was the only way to patrol a city that had vanished. 2 men to a line, sometimes 3, one leading, one following, each step taken by memory. Their lamps swung uselessly, their circles of light absorbed within inches. The sound of their boots was the only proof that the street beneath them still existed. At dusk, they left the stations in pairs, ropes coiled like serpents at their belts. They moved slowly, feeling their way along walls slick with moisture and soot. The fog muffled everything, the clip of hooves, the hiss of gas lamps, even their own voices. The city's familiar hum, the rattle of carts, the distant whistle of trains had been replaced by silence. The rope became not only a tether but a lifeline, the only thing separating a man from the peat-in, nothingness that waited a few paces ahead. Constable Alden of Holborn Division wrote later that the fog had thickness to it, like milk, but heavier, a thing that resisted movement. He described one night when his partner vanished mid-step, swallowed by the grey. The rope between them went slack. He shouted, but the sound went nowhere. When he pulled the line back, it came free, frayed and wet. Alden found the man 2 days later by the river, a faint smile still frozen on his lips. No one could explain how he'd reached the water. The ropes multiplied. Soon, every beat constable carried one, issued by the precincts alongside whistles and truncheons. They tied themselves to lampposts while directing carts through intersections, the cords stretching like spider silk through the murk. From above, if anyone could have seen from above, the city must have looked webbed in lines of faint movement, each thread quivering under the weight of the unseen. The policemen called it working the blind rope. It was their new compass, their new law. But even the rope could not save them from the air itself. They breathed shallowly, wrapping scarves over their faces, coughing between orders. Many collapsed mid-patrol, overcome by the fumes. The death reports read like wartime dispatches. Constable John Baines, asphyxiation. Constable Arthur Lowe, heart failure following exposure. In the morgues, their uniforms smelled of coal and wet stone. Their ropes, stained and stiff, were laid across their chests, as if in mockery, the same cords that had failed to lead them home. Yet still they went out. Each evening, through the worst of the smog, men tied knots around their waists and vanished into the yellow dark, the ropes linking them to stations they would never see again until dawn. And even when the fog began to lift, when wind at last tore the curtain and daylight returned, some constables kept their ropes. They carried them coiled at the belt, out of habit or superstition, a reminder that once, for 5 terrible days, London had become a void, and the only thing that held the living together was a length of rope and the hope that someone on the other end was still breathing. No one heard the church bell that morning. The air was too thick to carry sound, too heavy to allow it to rise. The undertakers arrived late, their horse-drawn carriage crawling along the cobblestones like a hearse in a dream. The fog hung low over the ground, the color of nicotine, swirling in slow circles, as if reluctant to let go of what it had taken. The coffin on the cart was slick with condensation, beads of water running down its black varnish. The driver could not see beyond the horse's tail, and when he turned to the man beside him, he could only make out a faint outline where a face should have been. The dead had been stacking up for days. The grave diggers at Highgate and Kensal Green worked by lantern light, their shovels clanging against frozen earth. There was no time for ceremony. The ground was crowded, the coffins waiting in lines like soldiers who had died without orders. Some were buried in shared graves, their names recorded hastily in ledgers already damp with soot. The newspapers printed lists of the deceased, but soon the columns grew too long. They began to list only numbers. Inside the churches, services went on in half-darkness. Candles guttered in the bad air, and priests coughed between psalms. The mourners arrived, draped in scarves and veils, their voices muffled. When they knelt, the fog followed them inside, seeping through cracks in the doors and hovering above the pews like restless spirits. It blurred faces, swallowed prayers, and dimmed the glow of the altar. The organist played softly, his fingers trembling. Each note struggled to survive, dying almost as soon as it was born. One funeral, they said, lasted nearly the entire day. The hearse had left the mortuary in Whitechapel at dawn, but by noon it had travelled barely a mile. The driver lost the road 3 times, circling aimlessly through a world without landmarks. People emerged from doorways to watch the black silhouette drift past, their outlines faint against the yellow haze. Some crossed themselves, others turned away, unwilling to witness another farewell they might soon share. By the time the carriage reached the cemetery gates, dusk had fallen. The priest waiting there said it felt like burying the whole city. The fog spared no one. The rich were buried in vaults, their funerals attended by the same air that killed them. The poor went into mass pits, their bodies wrapped in blankets, their names forgotten. A few coffins went unclaimed. The dead had no families left to mourn them. They were lowered into the earth in silence, the ropes slick with soot, the gravedigger's breath rising in pale clouds that mingled with the haze. When the fog finally lifted, the cemeteries were full. Rows of new graves stretched out beneath a sky the color of pewter. The people who came to visit stood quietly, unsure what to say. The city had buried too many to count, and the tolling of bells seemed almost cruel now. London had survived, but only just. And as the first true wind of winter blew through the graveyards, carrying away the last traces of smoke, it left behind a city still gasping alive, but mourning itself. On the 3rd night of the Great Smog, Covent Garden glowed like a lantern in the dark, a promise of elegance, clinging to a dying city. The carriages arrived one by one, their wheels squealing against the slick stones, their passengers stepping out into air that smelled of burning tar and rot. Men in top hats and women in silks pressed handkerchiefs to their mouths as they hurried inside. Within those walls, they believed, the world could still be civilized, music could still conquer misery. They were wrong. The fog was already waiting for them. Inside, the chandeliers flickered dimly through the haze that had followed them in, curling upward into the velvet rafters. The audience fanned themselves, though it was cold outside, not from heat, but from panic. The air had a texture, as though one could feel it pressing down upon the chest. Perfume mingled with smoke, and the smell of damp wool clung to every seat. On stage, the orchestra tuned their instruments with difficulty. The strings sounded dull, the brass wheezed. When the conductor raised his baton, the sound did not travel. The music emerged muted, blurred, as though performed underwater. At first, the audience tried to pretend nothing was wrong. They clapped politely, they laughed where they were meant to. But as the minutes passed, the coughing began. One woman in the front row fanned herself furiously, gasping between breaths. A gentleman behind her loosened his cravat, his face pale as candle wax. The sopranos' voices wavered in and out, their high notes strangled by the air. Musicians blinked through tears caused not by emotion, but by the sulphur stinging their eyes. In the balcony, someone fainted. Still, the performance continued. The show, as they said, must go on. But by the end of the first act, the fog had become a character of its own, creeping through the aisles, draping itself across the stage, swallowing the lights. From the back rows, the performers were barely visible, ghostly, figures moving in yellow mist. The conductor's hand slowed, his breathing grew audible between bars. The audience coughed in unison with the orchestra's rhythm, an accidental chorus of suffering. When the curtain fell, no one applauded. The audience sat frozen, listening to the hiss of the gas lamps and the distant rumble of carriages outside. Then, as if by mutual understanding, they began to rise. Quietly, methodically, like mourners leaving a chapel. The doors opened to reveal a wall of yellow-black air thicker than before. The fog had seeped inside fully now. Some people hesitated to leave, afraid they would not find their way home. Others simply stood in the foyer, staring at the vanished street beyond. By morning, Covent Garden was shuttered. The posters for La Traviata flapped limply against the damp brick, streaked with soot. The singers were sent home, their lungs raw, their throats burning. The newspapers wrote later that the performance had been cancelled due to crammed atmospheric irregularities. But those who were there never forgot the sound, the orchestra choking mid-song, the audience coughing in harmony, and the curtain falling not from a cue but from the simple weight of the air. London had lost not only its sight and breath, but its voice. The music, like the sun, had been silenced. The hospitals could no longer tell night from day. The fog pressed itself against the windows like a living thing, its yellow light seeping into every corridor. Inside, the lamps burned weakly, their glow swallowed almost at once. Nurses moved through the gloom with candles cupped in their hands, the wax running over their fingers, their faces masked in cloth. They were called angels, but they looked more like phantoms gliding silently between the beds, their aprons stained grey, their hair reeking of coal. The air indoors was only marginally better than the air outside. It carried the same heaviness, the same faint taste of iron and smoke. The wards overflowed. Beds had been pushed into the hallways, the chapel, the cafeteria, anywhere a cot could fit. Patients lay 3 to a room built for 1. Their coughing was constant, rhythmic, a sound that filled the building like a drumbeat. The doctors worked without pause, sleeves rolled up, stethoscopes black with soot. They could diagnose nothing but exhaustion. The lungs of the sick rattled when touched, their breath shallow, quick, terrified. Some patients stared at the ceiling for hours, waiting for the next inhale as though it might not come. Others fell asleep and did not wake. At Street Thomas's, the nurses had started writing the time of death on scraps of paper and pinning them to the blankets. The morgue was full, the stairwells lined with the covered bodies of those who had stopped breathing. Outside, hearses arrived and left in silence. Inside, the staff stopped counting. The matron forbade weeping not out of cruelty, but because every tear burned the eyes like acid. The youngest nurses collapsed first. They worked with scarves tied over their mouths, but the fog found its way through anyway. When one of them fainted during rounds, another simply stepped over her to reach the next bed. There were too many dying to stop. The patients called for water that tasted of ash, for air that no longer existed. When they coughed, the sound came wet and thick, and sometimes what they brought up was black. One doctor, an old man who had seen cholera and typhus, said he had never known anything like it. "You can fight disease," he whispered to a colleague, "but how do you fight air?" His hands trembled as he wrote the words "suffocation by atmosphere" into the register. He had to pause twice to wipe soot from the page. By the 5th night, the hospital itself had begun to die. The candles wouldn't stay lit, the gas lamps sputtered, and the halls grew colder. The nurses could see their own breath as they moved among the dying, their shadows long and distorted. Outside, the fog thickened again, wrapping the building in silence. When the wind finally began to stir faint, hesitant, the nurses gathered at the windows, afraid to hope. Somewhere beyond the haze, a bell rang. It might have been Street, Paul's, it might have been something else entirely. But they stopped what they were doing and listened, because for the first time in a week, the air moved. It was weak, thin, but it was air, and that meant the living, for now, could keep breathing. In the narrow terraces of Bethnal Green and Southwark, the air had turned to syrup. Each breath was labor. Each night, the fog pushed its way into homes like an uninvited guest, curling under doors and through cracks in the window panes. Families stuffed rags into the frames, nailed towels across the glass, did anything they could to keep it out. It didn't matter. The smog was patient. It crept through keyholes, through chimneys, through the spaces where walls no longer met. The people who lived inside those rooms soon realized there was no such thing as outside anymore. The world had become one continuous chamber, sealed by its own breath. In one such house, a mother named Ellen tried to open her window. Her baby had not stopped coughing for hours, and the room smelled of sweat and sickness. But the sash would not budge. The paint had melted in the damp and fused the wood shut. She pushed until her palms bled, but the frame might as well have been stone. Behind her, her husband sat by the fire, staring into the flames that burned dull and blue. He was afraid to look at the child. When the coughing finally stopped, he rose and laid his coat over the small body, as if covering it from the fog. Then he sat down again and said nothing. Stories like theirs multiplied by the hour. The city's poorest districts became silent except for the coughing, a chorus that rose and fell through the streets like the tide. Neighbors knocked on each other's doors, not to visit, but to check who was still alive. Those who could move went out in search of doctors, though they could barely find their way home again. The streets had lost their names, the lamps their light. Sometimes they came back with medicine. More often, they came back alone. Inside the homes of the wealthy, the fear was no less real, only more dignified. The fog pressed its filthy palms against stained glass windows and slipped under ornate doors. Parlors filled with the same sour smell that haunted the paces. Tenements, coal, mildew, and death. Servants moved quietly through corridors, emptying basins, tending to masters who wheezed into handkerchiefs embroidered with their initials. Even the parlors of Mayfair became sick rooms. In the hospitals, doctors began to speak of asphyxiation. "The air itself is closing in," one wrote in his journal. He could feel it in his own chest, a dull pressure, a slow drowning. At the homes of the dead, priests whispered prayers through scarves, their words muffled, their candles dim. They could not stay long. The fog made every visit a risk. And still the windows refused to open. London was sealed shut by its own making. Each pane of glass, once meant to welcome light, now trapped darkness inside. The city had built itself for comfort, for warmth, for progress, and now those very walls became its coffin. The fog was no longer outside. It had crossed the threshold. It was in the lungs, in the curtains, in the cracks of the floorboards. London was breathing itself to death, and the windows, painted shut with years of pride and neglect, watched without sympathy. By the sixth night, the city no longer looked like London, but it still smelled like it, only worse, a distorted version of itself. The scent of the place was everywhere, thick and unrelenting, a blend of coal smoke, wet wool, sewage, and something sweetly rotted beneath it all. People said you could tell the neighborhoods apart by how they decayed. In Whitechapel, it was the stink of tanneries and slaughterhouses. In Chelsea, the odor of damp velvet and perfume. By the river, a reek of mud and flesh and burnt oil. Every breath carried a story of the city's undoing. It began at the Thames. The river had become a long, dark lung, breathing foulness into every district. Its water steamed with chemicals, its banks slick with soot. Fish floated belly up near the piers, their scales blackened by the air. The wind carried that stench inland, mixing it with the fumes of countless hearths still burning low through the endless night. It clung to walls, to skin, to dreams. People washed their hands until they bled, but the smell lingered deep in the pores. Even indoors, there was no escape. Curtains reeked of smoke, sheets smelled of sweat and fear. The scent of the city had become the scent of its people. Doctors said the fog had turned corrosive, the sulfur in it, reacting with the very fabric of life. Metal rusted overnight, bread went stale before it cooled, milk soured in unopened bottles. The smell of decay had become so constant that people no longer flinched. They simply lived within it, as fish live in water, not noticing the poison until it was too late. There were stories of people losing consciousness mid-step, not from panic, but from the sheer saturation of fumes. Carters dropped in their tracks, horses fell foaming to the ground, and by the time rescuers arrived, both man and beast shared the same grey pallor. The corpses were laid side by side, indistinguishable save for the smell, human or animal. The difference had blurred. Undertakers dusted themselves with lavender powder before stepping into the streets, but even that fragrance turned rancid within minutes. The newspapers, when they finally resumed printing, could not ignore it. "The stench of death hangs over London," one headline read. But no ink could capture what the air truly carried: the smell of the city's past burning in its present. Every ton of coal shoveled into a furnace was a memory turned to smoke. Factories that had built fortunes, ships that had ruled oceans, fires that had once meant comfort, it all returned now through the nose, heavy and inescapable, as if London were being forced to inhale its own history. When the wind finally came, weak and uncertain, it did not clear the odor, it only spread it thinner. Days later, when the fog began to lift, people noticed the silence first, not the smell. But for years afterward, on damp December mornings, Londoners would pause, sniff the air, and remember, not the sight of their vanished streets, nor the soundless bells, but that unbearable scent, the smell of a city realizing it was mortal. When the fog was at its thickest, even shadows disappeared. That was when they found the boy, or rather, when someone tripped over him. It was late in the afternoon, though the air was still as dark as midnight. A man walking home from the docks felt something soft beneath his boot, something that groaned faintly before falling still. He bent down, hands outstretched, and touched what he first thought was a bundle of rags. But then he felt the outline of a small arm, cold and limp. The child could not have been more than 6. He was barefoot, his clothes soaked through, his lips cracked and blackened at the corners. When the man lifted him, the boy's head lolled back, and the sound that left his mouth was more a sigh than a breath. The man carried him toward the nearest light, a weak lantern swinging in the fog outside a shop. The shopkeeper saw the shape emerge and ran forward, but the moment he opened his door, the fog rushed in behind them like a wave. Together they laid the boy on the counter. He weighed nothing. His chest rose shallowly, then stopped, then rose again with effort. They rubbed his hands, his arms, trying to summon warmth. Someone brought water, someone else brandy, and someone fetched a constable. When the officer arrived, his face was grey beneath his helmet. He touched the boy's cheek and said softly, "There's more of 'em out there." He was right. The fog had turned the city into a labyrinth of the lost. Children disappeared by the dozens, not taken, not hidden, simply gone. Some wandered from home in confusion, chasing voices they thought were their mothers calling from the street. Others were sent on errands and never returned. When the fog cleared days later, the police found small bodies in alleys, on stairwells, in gutters. Some had frozen, some had suffocated, some had simply lain down to sleep and never woken. The smog had been merciful in its silence. It took without violence. The boy from the alleyway was carried to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where the nurses washed the soot from his skin. Beneath the grime, he was pale, almost translucent. He had a faint scar above his eyebrow, a bruise along his collarbone. The matron guessed his name might have been Tom. Half the boys in London were called Tom. She wrote Thomas, unknown, in the logbook, then moved on to the next patient. That night, the boy died. His lungs had filled with soot. His body was wrapped in linen and placed beside 6 others, all unnamed. In the morning, a nurse passing the alleyway saw something white on the ground, the boy's small handkerchief, embroidered with one crooked initial. She picked it up and pressed it to her face. It smelled faintly of smoke and peppermint. She kept it in her pocket for years afterward, through wars and winters, as a reminder that the Great Smog was not only numbers and reports, but faces, small, pale faces that disappeared quietly, one by one, into the dark. London would recover, rebuild, breathe again. But for those who lived through it, the memory of that child and the thousands like him lingered longer than the smoke itself. They were the price the city paid for its fire, and their absence haunted every clear morning that followed. By the end of the week, the dead outnumbered the living, who could still breathe easily. London's morgues, already cramped in the best of winters, became chambers of quiet horror. At the Westminster mortuary, bodies were stacked too deep against the walls, their outlines blurred by the fog that had followed them inside. The attendants worked by the faint glow of oil lamps, their faces ghostly in the dim light. The air was thick with the mingled smells of disinfectant, damp wood, and decay, a scent that seemed to cling to every garment and breath. The first day, they tried to keep order. Each body was tagged with a name if one could be found, or simply marked unknown. But by the third day, there were too many. The clerks could not write quickly enough. The ink froze on their pens, the ledgers smeared with soot and fingerprints. Some of the dead arrived with their eyes open, as though still looking for air. Others were small bundles, infants wrapped in blankets turned grey by the fog. The nurses whispered prayers over them while the undertakers worked in silence. Carts lined the alley behind the building, their contents covered in tarpaulins that did little to hide the shape of what lay beneath. When the wagons filled, the horses were led away, coughing, their sides heaving from the same poison that had killed their masters. More carts came from the East End, from hospitals and workhouses and private homes. The fog itself seemed to escort them, following the trail of death as if it wished to bear witness. Inside, the attendants moved with mechanical calm. They had stopped removing their masks, not that the thin cloth did much to block the smell. One man said later that he could still taste the soot for years afterward, that he dreamed of the color yellow, the hue of sickness that never left the walls. They tried to keep the bodies cold, but the fog had seeped into the icehouse, softening the air until even the dead began to sweat. When space finally ran out, the authorities opened temporary morgues in schoolhouses, church basements, and railway depots. Coffins were too few, the carpenters could not keep up. Some families were given crates instead. Priests moved from building to building. Blessing rooms filled wall to wall with the still. They said their voices echoed strangely, as though the fog were answering. No one dared linger long inside. Even those who came to identify relatives stood only a moment before stepping back into the streets. A woman searching for her husband fainted when she found him, his face unrecognizable under a sheen of soot. A constable carried her out, coughing all the while. When she woke, she did not ask to see him again. By the time the smog began to lift, the morgues had become symbols of the city's shame, proof that London had not simply endured a bad fog, but a man-made plague. The officials tried to count the bodies, to put a number to what had been lost. But numbers could not measure the silence that followed. In those rooms where the fog still lingered long after the wind had come, one truth remained hanging in the air. London had filled its lungs with progress, and the cost was measured not in soot, but in souls. When the fog finally began to thin, London emerged pale and unsteady, like a patient waking after an illness. The wind returned weakly, carrying the smell of rot and coal through streets that had forgotten what movement felt like. The worst had passed, but now came the reckoning. The bodies had to be counted. Someone had to write down what the air had done. It fell to the clerks, quiet men with ink-stained fingers and hollow eyes. Men used to ledgers and columns, not coffins. They were summoned from borough offices and civil registries to tally the losses. Their instructions were simple: compile the names of the dead, their ages, their occupations, their causes of death. The city needed numbers, not grief. It was easier to face statistics than faces. They set up tables in hospitals, police stations, and church halls. The paperwork arrived faster than they could sort its sheaves of death certificates, smudged and soot-streaked, written in hurried hands by doctors who had long since stopped pretending to diagnose. The causes read like variations of a single note: asphyxiation, bronchitis, heart failure, smoke inhalation. Some said only fog. The clerks dipped their pens and began to write, their wrists aching, their throats burning from air that still held the ghost of poison. Each entry became an act of translation, turning tragedy into record. They paused over the names of children, over addresses that repeated like refrains: Whitechapel, Stepney, Lambeth, Bermondsey. The poor had died first, and in the greatest numbers. The fog, like poverty, did not travel uphill. In Kensington and Mayfair, the toll was lower. In the slums, entire families were gone. Yet in the final tally, no distinction would be made. The ledgers cared for no hierarchy. Death was democratic. At night, when the clerks returned home, they could not wash the smell from their skin. They carried the scent of ink, damp paper, and something faintly metallic, the residue of other people's endings. One man, a registrar from Clerkenwell, confessed to his wife that he could still hear the scratching of his pen in his dreams. Another fell ill himself and was found slumped over his desk, his final notation half finished. When the totals were announced weeks later, the number shocked even the hardened. 12,000 gone, perhaps more. But the truth was larger. Many deaths were never recorded: old men who died alone in rooms too cold to enter, infants buried before dawn to save the cost of a coffin. The clerks knew this, but the ledgers were closed anyway. The city had its figures. The newspapers printed them in bold type, and London turned the page. Yet in quiet offices, long after the public moved on, the men who counted the dead kept working. They filed the certificates, labeled the boxes, sealed them away in archives where dust would settle over the years. And in that silence, among the stacks of names, they understood what few others dared to, that the fog had not just killed people, it had erased them, leaving behind only handwriting as proof that they had once drawn breath. London would rebuild, and new smoke would rise from new chimneys. But the clerks would remember. Every number they wrote was a ghost that still hovered over the city's air. The fog did not reach the Prime Minister's office the way it reached the rest of London. The air inside Whitehall was filtered, the fires tended by servants who used the finer coal cleaner, less choking. Still, even there, the smell of decay slipped in through the cracks, faint but insistent, like a whisper that refused to die. Outside, the carriages could barely move through the haze. Parliament Square was deserted except for policemen with ropes tied around their waists. Inside, the nation's leaders debated what to call the disaster that had buried their capital alive. They settled on a meteorological anomaly. The phrase sounded intelligent, detached something nature had done, not man. To admit otherwise would mean confronting the truth that progress itself had turned lethal. The coal that fueled the empire, the smoke that marked its success, had finally demanded payment. But the Prime Minister, a cautious man with a careful tongue, would not say so aloud. Each morning, he received reports from the Home Office: numbers of deaths, areas most affected, pleas from hospitals running out of beds. He read them slowly, his expression unchanging. He asked questions about trade and transport, about coal supply and productivity, but not about lungs or funerals. When an aide suggested an emergency address to calm the public, he shook his head. "Panic," he said, "is more dangerous than fog." The aide said nothing further. Outside his window, the faint outline of the Thames could sometimes be seen shifting under the fog, as though the river itself were breathing with difficulty. Across the city, tens of thousands struggled for air. But inside that office, the silence was immaculate. The telephones rang, papers shuffled, pens scratched softly across parchment. Bureaucracy continued, neat and undisturbed. In the House of Commons, when questions were finally raised, the ministers spoke in abstractions. One referred to unfortunate atmospheric density. Another suggested that citizens avoid unnecessary exertion. Not a word was said about coal. The opposition demanded accountability. How had a modern city been brought to its knees by its own smoke? The Prime Minister replied with a half smile. "London has weathered worse." His tone suggested reassurance, his eyes exhaustion. Meanwhile, the newspapers pleaded for leadership. Doctors sent open letters detailing the hundreds dead from suffocation. The clergy called for repentance. The public wanted a name to blame, but none came. The fog, faceless and wordless, was the perfect scapegoat. When the air finally cleared, the Prime Minister gave a short statement to the press. He called it a tragic episode, an act of nature, and a reminder of our city's resilience. His words were polished, harmless, and quickly forgotten. He did not mention the soot that still clung to windowsills or the thousands buried without names. In private, it was said that he wept once quietly, behind a closed door, when told that his own chauffeur had died from lung failure after spending those 5 days waiting outside. The tears lasted less than a minute. Then he composed himself, wiped his spectacles, and returned to his desk. There were new reports to read, new shipments to approve, and a new winter coming. The fog might have lifted, but silence that, at least, remained. In the gilded stillness of Buckingham Palace, even the fog arrived with ceremony. It seeped through the gates, rolled across the gravel of the courtyard, and rose to the windows like a tide claiming marble cliffs. The guards outside stood motionless, their red coats dulled to brown by the soot. From the palace roof, the Union Jack was invisible, its colors lost in the thick yellow air. Within those walls, far from the choking streets, the same poison crept silently softer, but no less deadly. The Queen had asked for her window to be opened that morning. She wanted to see her city, to assure herself that it still existed beyond the gloom. But when the valet pulled aside the curtains, there was nothing there, only a dim glow where the sun should have been. The air that entered the room smelled faintly of sulphur and ash. Her ladies-in-waiting coughed discreetly behind gloved hands. "Close it," she said quietly. The window was shut, and London disappeared once more. Reports had reached her daily. Thousands dead, hospitals overflowing, children suffocating in their sleep. Ministers arrived pale and trembling, their collars damp from the fog. They spoke carefully, sparing her the worst details. Yet she could see the truth in their faces, could hear it in the rattle of their breath as they bowed. Her own lungs had begun to ache faintly, a dull pressure that came and went. The palace doctors insisted it was only fatigue, but she knew otherwise. The air had turned against them all. Outside, the palace gardens were unrecognizable. The hedges glistened black, the fountains still, their surfaces coated with oily residue. The swans on the lake had fled days before. Even the roses, her pride, her joy, had wilted overnight, their petals mottled by soot. The Queen walked among them once, wrapped in furs, her steps slow and careful. "It smells like the end of the world," she murmured, though no one dared reply. Inside, the servants moved in silence. Fires were lit in every room, but the warmth brought no comfort. Only more smoke, more weight to the air. Meals went untouched. The food tasted of coal. Letters from abroad arrived expressing sympathy, curiosity, disbelief. Paris wrote of mourning, New York of astonishment, Delhi of warning. Yet none could understand what it was to stand in the heart of an empire and feel it suffocate around you. That night, the Queen sat alone in her study, a single lamp burning beside her. On the desk lay the latest report from the Home Office, its language as cold as the ink it was written in. Casualties, approximately 12,000. Further review ongoing. She read it twice, her eyes stinging, not from tears but from the air itself. Then she folded the paper, placed it in a drawer, and whispered to the empty room, "Even crowns cannot command the wind." When the smog finally lifted days later, the first thing she did was open that same window again. The air that entered was thin, bitter, and sharp, but it was air. She took one long breath and looked toward the faint outline of the city. London was still there, battered and ghostly, waiting beneath the pale sky. She exhaled slowly, as if testing whether her city and her kingdom could still do the same. When the first light returned, it revealed not a city reborn, but one bleached of its soul. The smog had retreated, but it left behind a world drained of hue. The sky was a sickly grey, the Thames a band of dull lead. Buildings once proud and golden beneath the morning sun now stood the colour of bone. Even the people seemed monochrome, faces pale, clothes muted, eyes hollow. It was as if the fog had not merely hidden London, but erased it, leaving behind only a sketch in ash and sorrow. The newspapers called it the cleansing, as though the storm had washed the city clean. But those who stepped into the streets knew better. There was nothing clean about what remained. The soot clung to every surface, to windows, to cobblestones. to the undersides of leaves that had somehow survived. When people brushed their fingers against walls, they came away black. Laundry hung stiff on the lines untouched by wind, and the air, though breathable now, still carried the faint tang of burning coal, a ghost that refused to leave. Children emerged first. They ran through the streets as though testing whether the ground still held, their laughter thin and uncertain. Behind them came the adults, slow and wary. Shopkeepers opened shutters to find their goods ruined, their awnings sagging under grime. The bakers swept their floors 3 times before lighting their ovens. Every brushstroke of daily life required cleansing, and yet nothing truly shone. The fog had seeped into everything: fabric, wood, lungs, memory. In the markets of Spitalfields, a woman selling oranges realized with horror that the fruit had turned grey overnight. The soot had coated their skins so evenly that they looked carved from stone. She wiped one clean with her apron, revealing a flash of color beneath, and gasped. The small miracle drew a crowd. People stared at that single orange spot as if it were sunlight itself. For a brief moment, they remembered color: the red of brick, the blue of sky, the green of gardens now long dead. And then they turned away, ashamed of their awe. Painters and photographers wandered through the streets in silence. Some tried to capture what they saw, a city half alive, half buried, but their palettes betrayed them. No pigment seemed right. The fog had taught them a new shade, the color of absence. It was inescapable. The art that followed would bear its mark for decades: pale faces, empty skies, streets vanishing into haze. At night, the gas lamps burned again, but their light felt cruel. It showed too much: the filth, the exhaustion, the grief. Lovers walked arm in arm through the remnants of the fog, their breath still visible, their silhouettes grey against grey. London had survived, but its brilliance had dimmed. The city that once glowed with the fire of empire now looked tired, faded, humbled. It had seen itself stripped bare: its beauty, its arrogance, its illusions, and what remained was fragile. For the first time in memory, the people of London looked up not to marvel at their city, but to mourn it. The fog had gone, but the color had not returned. And somewhere in that vast grey silence, the city seemed to understand that it never fully would. By the 4th night, time had lost meaning. The smog had turned the clockwork rhythm of London into something dreamlike: a single, unending hour stretched thin over the city. No one could tell when one day ended and another began. Lamps burned until they guttered out, and still the darkness did not lift. The air outside felt thick enough to drink, each breath dragging through the throat like smoke through a chimney. Those who still ventured out did so wrapped in scarves, voices muffled, moving like ghosts through a world that no longer obeyed dawn or dusk. In the slums of Southwark, a woman named Annie Cripps sat by her window counting the seconds between her husband's coughs. She had stopped lighting the fire. The smoke only made it worse. The fog seeped through the boards, pressing against her face like wet cloth. Her husband's breathing rattled like a loose hinge. Each time it stopped, she leaned closer to listen, afraid it would not start again. Somewhere outside, a baby was crying, a thin, distant sound that wove through the silence like a thread refusing to break. Annie whispered a prayer she no longer believed in. Across the river, at the docks, men worked by touch. They could no longer see the ropes or the crates, only feel their edges through gloves slick with condensation. The water below was invisible, its sound swallowed by the fog. A foreman gave orders that no one could hear. Someone slipped, someone screamed, and then there was nothing but the hiss of the river taking him. The men kept working. There was no other choice. London's commerce could not stop, even when its people did. Farther west, in Bloomsbury, a group of students from the university huddled in their lodgings, reading by candlelight. The room was thick with tobacco smoke and fear. They spoke in whispers about the air, its chemical composition, its weight, its taste. Sulfur dioxide, one said, mixed with tar. You can taste the iron, can't you? He coughed. into his sleeve. They wrote their observations in journals, not realizing that one day those words would serve as history, the anatomy of a city slowly asphyxiating itself. Outside, the world had narrowed to the space one could touch. The air distorted sound, footsteps seemed to come from nowhere, voices echoed without bodies. Horses stood motionless in the streets, refusing to move. Even the rats had grown quiet, scurrying unseen through the dark. When church bells tried to ring, their tones died after a few yards, as if the air itself had grown solid. And yet, amid the stillness, London pulsed faintly, stubbornly. Some prayed, some worked, some simply sat and waited. There was no panic left, only resignation, the slow surrender of people who had learned that suffering could be ordinary. When morning came, it brought no light. The fog remained, heavy and patient, stretching its fingers through every street and alleyway. In those endless hours, the city seemed to hang between worlds, not alive, not dead, merely enduring. The fourth night was not the worst of the Great Smog, nor the deadliest. It was something quieter. The moment when London stopped fighting and began to listen to its own silence, realizing it had finally become part of the fog itself. When the final morning came, no one recognized it as morning at all. The light that crept through London was thin and sickly, a pale imitation of dawn, filtered through layers of yellow dust. It carried no warmth, only revelation. The fog had begun to loosen its hold, drawing back in shreds and tatters like an old curtain being pulled from a broken window. What it left behind was a city unmasked, scarred, grey, and silent. The first to notice were the night workers, men who had survived the long dark hours by instinct alone. The dock hands at Rotherhithe saw a faint shimmer on the river's surface, a glint of light that made them stop mid-motion. It was not beautiful, it was startling, almost painful. The Thames itself looked sick, a ribbon of black water coated in filth, its edges rimmed with the debris of death. But it was visible. They could see it again, and for a moment, that was enough. In the streets, people emerged from doorways like sleepers, waking from a bad dream. They blinked against the new brightness, squinting at shapes that had not existed for days, the outline of lampposts, the edges of rooftops, the faded colors of the markets. Every surface was coated with a fine crust of soot that turned to sludge beneath the first hesitant drops of rain. The air, though lighter, still burned the throat. It smelled of coal and decay, of things too long confined, but it was air. For the first time in nearly a week, London could breathe. The hospitals stirred first. Nurses pulled back curtains to reveal a world they had almost forgotten. The weak sunlight slanted across faces pale as parchment. Some of the patients stirred and smiled faintly, mistaking the brightness for recovery. Others did not stir at all. The doctors, hollow-eyed and hoarse, moved through the wards like men crossing a battlefield after the smoke had cleared. They opened windows that stuck in their frames, forcing them upward with trembling hands. The breeze that entered was cold, sharp, and miraculous. Across the city, church bells began to ring again, not all at once, but tentatively, uncertain whether sound could still travel. Their notes were cracked and uneven, echoing through streets still heavy with silence. People stopped to listen, their faces lifted toward the grey sky. The sound seemed to cleanse something inside them, a reminder that the world still had a voice. By midday, the fog was gone. What replaced it was worse in its honesty. The roads were lined with the remnants of those who had fallen, collapsed carriages, dead horses, abandoned carts. Windows stood shattered, doors left open. The air felt naked, even the wind seemed ashamed of what it revealed. In the gutters, rainwater ran black, carrying soot toward the river like blood draining from a wound. That night, Londoners lay awake, unable to sleep in the brightness that had returned. They listened to the strange sound of their own lungs drawing breath, half afraid the air might thicken again before morning. For the first time, they knew it was not the darkness that had almost destroyed them, but the very thing they had built to make light. And as the rain fell steadily over the city, washing away the grime of 5 terrible days, The living learned what the dead already knew, that survival does not always mean salvation. When the fog had lifted completely, the city found itself in a silence that was not peace but shock. London looked like a battlefield. After the troops had gone, the smoke cleared, the bodies buried, yet the earth still trembling from what it had endured. The streets, once bustling and sure, moved with the cautious rhythm of a city learning to breathe again. But soon, breath would give way to counting. It was time to measure what could never truly be measured. The government ordered a full review. Clerks, coroners, and physicians were summoned to account for the dead. At first, the official line spoke of a few hundred fatalities, a tragedy, yes, but contained. But within days, the truth began to seep out, like soot under a door. Hospitals reported hundreds more men, women, children. Their lungs blackened, their hearts stopped mid-cough. The undertakers, their carts still damp from the rain that had followed the smog, could barely keep up with demand. Morgues overflowed into schoolhouses and church crypts. The numbers began to multiply. The first estimates spoke of 4,000. By the end of the week, 6. Within a month, 12,000 Londoners were gone, suffocated, poisoned, their deaths written into ledgers with the same bureaucratic precision as tax receipts. For every name recorded, there were others lost to anonymity. Infants who had never been christened, the homeless whose bodies were found only when the fog had retreated, the elderly who had died alone in rooms where no one came to knock. In the offices of Whitehall, the arithmetic continued. Clerks tallied columns by candlelight, adding row upon row of tragedy until the ink itself seemed to weigh more heavily on the page. A statistician named Harold Darnell, who had survived the fog only by staying indoors for 5 days straight, was tasked with compiling the master report. He worked in silence, his pen scratching through the night. "The city choked itself to death," he wrote at the margin of one draft, then crossed it out before submitting it to his superior. Some truths were not meant for the record. Across London, funerals became as common as church bells. Entire streets walked behind coffins, their faces covered still with scarves, though the air was clear. The smell of flowers could not disguise the lingering odor of soot and disinfectant. A woman at Kensal Green fainted during her husband's burial, overcome not by grief, but by the realization that the ground beneath her feet was already full. The earth, too, had begun to cough. By February, Parliament acknowledged what the people already knew, that this had not been a freak storm or divine punishment, but a human creation. The fog had been London's own invention, born from its chimneys, its factories, its ceaseless hunger for warmth and progress. The reckoning was not only of numbers, but of conscience. The city that had prided itself on conquering the natural world had finally discovered the cost of its conquest. And yet, when spring arrived, the fires burned again. The trains ran, the furnaces roared, and the same smoke began once more to rise into the pale sky. London had learned to count its dead, but not to change its ways. The reckoning was written in ledgers, not in hearts. The fog had gone, but its lesson remained invisible, waiting, patient as the air itself. When the fog had passed and the morning began, the doctors found themselves both witnesses and survivors. They had stood at the front lines of an invisible war, armed only with stethoscopes, wet cloths, and despair. Now, as the city demanded explanations, they were asked to become historians of death. But their words came too late. The patients were gone, the charts incomplete, and the air itself, the killer they needed to study, had already changed its form and vanished. In the weeks that followed, physicians gathered in lecture halls still reeking faintly of coal and disinfectant. The windows were thrown open now, though the drafts made their eyes water and their papers flutter. They spoke in low voices, describing the symptoms that had filled their wards: the blue lips, the swollen lungs, the blood that came up black. They spoke of children gasping in their sleep, of women whose lungs had hardened like plaster, of men who had lived through the Blitz only to be defeated by the calm of winter. "The air," said one doctor, was heavier than our medicine. Another whispered, "We were treating smoke as though it were disease." Among them was Dr. Hugh Langford of Street, Bartholomew's, who had kept a notebook during the crisis. It was found later among his things, a diary of a dying city. In it he wrote, "December 7th, they are drowning in the open air. No fever, no infection, only suffocation. We can hear it in their chests, the sound of coal turned to breath." He had sent a copy of his notes to the Ministry of Health, urging immediate study into air quality, but the reply came weeks later, polite, bureaucratic, dismissive. "Your observations are noted, Doctor. We will convene a committee in due course." By then, Langford was dead himself, his heart stopped by the very fumes he had tried to warn against. In their reports, the doctors did not use words like crime or neglect. They were men of science, trained to avoid moral judgment. Yet every line of their writing trembled with accusation. They knew the fog had been preventable. For years they had petitioned Parliament about the rising levels of sulfur dioxide, the soot thickening in the lungs of factory workers, the black snow that fell each winter over East London. Their warnings had been ignored. Progress, after all, had no patience for diagnosis. The medical journals published paper after paper describing the peculiar pathology of atmospheric poisoning. They dissected lungs that crumbled under their instruments, found veins lined with ash, hearts scarred by air. They debated whether it was chemical reaction or simple suffocation that had killed so many. The truth was both. The air had turned against its own. When the Royal College of Physicians finally presented its findings to Parliament, spring had already arrived, and the city had moved on. The coal barges were back on the river, their cargo glinting in the sun. The lawmakers listened, nodded, and adjourned. No new policy was passed that day. Years later, one of those same doctors would write, "We were not silent, we were unheard." Their voices had been lost in the same haze that had choked their patients, the smog of indifference that hung far longer than the fog itself. And though the air grew clearer with time, London would always carry that echo in its lungs, the memory of those who tried to speak, and the silence that killed with them. It began quietly, as all revolutions do, not with banners or shouts, but with paper, reports, pamphlets, petitions. The fog had lifted, but its shadow remained, and for the first time, Londoners began to demand that the air be made fit for the living. The movement was called many things at first: the Fresh Air Society, the Anti-Smog League, the London Clean Air Crusade. It had no single leader, no headquarters, only a shared conviction that what had happened in December must never happen again. The first meetings were held in church basements, still smelling faintly of incense and coal smoke. Doctors, clergymen, school teachers and mothers gathered under flickering gas lamps to speak of what they had seen. Children who coughed themselves to sleep, old men who died in their chairs, shopkeepers who vanished into the fog and were found days later cold and still. They did not speak of politics or economics, but of breath. "We have learned to count our dead," said one vicar, "but not our blessings, and they are numbered too, if the air continues to burn." From these humble gatherings came a chorus that could not be ignored. Letters flooded the newspapers, demanding reform. The Times published a series of editorials titled "Death by Progress," while smaller publications spoke more plainly, "We are killing ourselves for warmth." Activists wrote to Parliament, to the coal barons, to anyone with the power to change the city's course. A group of housewives from Brixton marched on Westminster carrying placards scrawled with a single phrase, "Let US breathe." They were mocked by some, applauded by others, but they made the front page. Scientists joined the cause next, armed with data and conviction. The Royal College of Physicians released new studies, showing the toll of air pollution not just in deaths, but in the slow erosion of life itself. Weakened hearts, damaged lungs, eyes that watered perpetually in the grey haze. They warned that the Great Smog was not an isolated tragedy but a warning, a glimpse of the future if the city refused to change. "The air," one report declared, is as much a part of public health as water. It was a radical notion for its time that the sky could be governed, that invisible things could be law. Industry resisted, of course. The coal magnates called the reformers, dreamers, idealists, even traitors. They claimed that London's greatness had always been written in smoke. The fog, one executive told Parliament, is the breath of civilization. But the people had seen civilization choke on its own breath. The old romance of the smoky skyline had died with the 12,000 buried under it. By the spring of 1953, the movement had reached every corner of the city. Artists painted skies of blue for the first time in years. Schoolchildren wrote essays titled "The Day the Sun Returned." In Parliament, a new bill was whispered into existence, tentative, fragile, but real. The clean air crusade was winning not with noise, but with persistence. And yet, the crusaders knew their work was not merely to purify the air, but the conscience of a nation that had mistaken smoke for strength. They carried lanterns through the same streets where the fog had once reigned, their light steady, their voices clear. "Never again," they said. The phrase echoed softly through the city, not a threat, but a promise rising, for the first time in years, into a sky that was learning how to be blue again. Parliament convened in spring beneath skies still pale with the memory of soot. The fog had lifted, but its shadow hung over every debate. The House of Commons was packed ministers, reformers, coal barons, industrialists, and doctors, all pressing into the chamber like anxious lungs ready to burst. For the first time in living memory, the air itself was the agenda. They called it the London Air Bill, though the papers already had another name for it, the Parliament of Smoke. The Prime Minister opened the session with a speech as cautious as a man stepping through fog. He acknowledged recent tragedies, praised the resilience of our people, and promised a thorough investigation into atmospheric irregularities. It was the language of distance, the same old dance of sympathy without confession. But outside the chamber, London had run out of patience for such politeness. Dr. Margaret Fields, one of the few women ever invited to address the Commons, stood before the assembly with her notes trembling in her hands. She had treated victims during the smog, children who had suffocated in their own beds, mothers who had died trying to shield them from the poison. Her voice was quiet at first, but it grew as she spoke. "We do not need further inquiry. We have evidence in the graves. London cannot live on coal dust and excuses." This was not weather, it was policy. The chamber stirred, half in admiration, half in discomfort. From the benches opposite came the counter-arguments, smooth, confident, perfumed with denial. A coal magnate named Sir Bertram Reed declared that the good English fog had always been part of the nation's character. "We are a people of industry," he said, his hand on the rail as though gripping a relic. "Our smoke built this empire. Shall we outlaw the very breath that made us strong?" Applause followed, brief, uncertain, hollow. The reformers answered with data, with testimonies, with the quiet fury of those who had buried too many. Doctors presented mortality figures, engineers proposed new fuels. An elderly vicar stood in the gallery and whispered a prayer for the dead. The debate stretched into evening. Candles guttered in the stale air of the chamber, a bitter irony, for each one added its own thin trail of smoke. Outside, a crowd had gathered in Parliament Square. They carried signs scrawled with slogans: "Clear air, clean conscience. The fog killed my son." The people could not see the speeches inside, but they could hear them faintly through the open doors, voices rising and falling, hope battling habit. When the session adjourned just after midnight, the crowd remained. They sang softly into the night. Hymns of mourning turned into chants of resolve. The papers the next morning were divided. Some praised the bravery of the reformers, others mocked them as sentimental dreamers. But the tide had turned. For the first time, smoke was not seen as a sign of strength, but of sickness. London's great machine had been forced to look upon its reflection, blackened, weary, human. The Parliament of Smoke did not end with a law that day. It ended with a silence not of defeat, but of reckoning. As the members filed out into the cold air, each man and woman breathed carefully, aware at last of the cost of every breath. And somewhere beyond the grey rooftops, the first star in weeks managed to pierce the sky, faint but unwavering, a promise that light, once lost, could return if only the world would let it. It took 3 years for London to turn its mourning into law. 3 years of arguments, amendments, and delays of committees drowning in paper, while the memory of the dead began to fade from headlines. But the survivors did not forget. The mothers who had buried children, the doctors who had counted lungs filled with soot, the clerks who had written thousands of names into the ledgers of the lost, they kept speaking. They wrote letters, stood in doorways, and filled galleries during debates. They waited for Parliament to remember its promise. And finally, in 1956, the promise became words on parchment: the Clean Air Act. The act was not poetic, but it was radical. It declared that the air itself, that invisible, shared inheritance, was now the concern of the state. It restricted the burning of coal in domestic hearths, ordered the creation of smokeless zones, and required industries to clean their emissions before releasing them skyward. It was, for its time, a revolution written in ink. Yet even as the Prime Minister signed it into law, the weight of the fog still hung in the room, unspoken but present the memory of 5 days that had rewritten an empire's pride. For the people of London, the act meant change measured not in speeches, but in small mercies. Coal merchants began selling new, cleaner fuels, pale, dry briquettes that burned without the familiar hiss or scent. Chimneys that had smoked for generations stood cold for the first time. In Whitechapel, women hung white linens from windows and wept when they dried the same color. Children played in parks where sunlight once never reached the grass. Even the pigeons, absent since the Great Smog, returned hesitantly to the city squares. But not everyone celebrated. The coal barons cursed the legislation as the death of British industry. "They'll have us breathing nothing but taxes next," one man was heard to mutter outside Westminster. Factory owners complained of expense, of regulation, of progress being shackled by sentiment. They were wrong, but their protests echoed the same arrogance that had once blanketed the city in death. Still, the tide of conscience had shifted. The memory of the Great Smog lingered too heavily in the lungs of the living to be dismissed again. In schools, teachers began to speak of it not as disaster, but as turning point. "We learned to build cities," one wrote on the blackboard, "but now we must learn to keep them alive." Newspapers ran photographs of London's skyline glowing clear for the first time in decades. Parliament called it a victory of science and reason. The people called it survival. And though the act did not erase the scars, it gave the city something rarer than forgiveness. It gave it air. The fog would come again in smaller ghosts, drifting through alleyways and over the river, but never again with that same suffocating power. The law had drawn a boundary, invisible yet profound, between what the city could endure and what it would no longer accept. When the first blue sky of spring spread over London that year, the bells of street halls rang bright and unbroken. Children pointed upward, marveling that the sky could be a color other than grey. It was only air, simple, unseen, taken for granted, but it was also a promise kept. For the first time in generations, London could breathe without apology. For a time, it seemed as though London succeeded in erasing the memory. The city had always been good at forgetting wars, plagues, fires, each buried under the next wave of progress. The Great Smog, too, began to fade, not from the lungs of those who had survived it, but from conversation. People stopped mentioning the week, when the air had turned solid, when the sun had disappeared. They told themselves it was over, that the past was best left in the dark. Forgetting, after all, was easier than remembering how easily the world could choke. By the early 1960s, the city gleamed again. Buildings once blackened by soot were scrubbed clean, revealing pale stone that few had ever seen before. Tourists gasped at Westminster's whiteness, at the golden spires of Street Pancras revealed after decades under grime. London seemed reborn, proud of its transformation. Newspapers ran features titled "The New London Air," showing children flying kites in parks once blanketed by smoke. Advertisements praised the virtues of modern fuel and pure combustion. The air was no longer a threat. It was a commodity to be sold, bottled, and branded. Yet beneath the optimism, a quiet unease remained. Those who had lived through the Great Smog could never quite smell rain without catching a trace of sulfur. They were reminded in small ways in the haze that lingered after a cold morning, in the taste of coal dust that sometimes clung to the back of the throat. It was as though the air itself carried memory, invisible but faithful. Dr. Margaret Fields, now grey-haired and retired, refused to forget. She kept her old notes on her desk, the pages still smudged with soot. "You can't forgive a city for killing its children," she once told a journalist, "but you can teach it not to do it again." Her interviews appeared briefly in the papers before being replaced by stories of new industries, new cars, new smokestacks rising along the horizon. Progress had found its breath again, though it still smelled faintly of the past. The government, proud of its legislation, moved on to other matters. The Clean Air Act was hailed as a success, its existence proof enough that the problem had been solved. Reports warning of rising pollution in new industrial towns were filed, then forgotten. London had learned to sweep its ghosts beneath its pavements. The city that had once drowned in its own air now pretended that the sky had always been blue. But the survivors knew, on certain winter mornings, when the fog rolled low over the Thames and the light dimmed just so, they could feel the old fear stirring. Shopkeepers paused while unlocking their doors. Mothers drew their curtains a little tighter. In the sudden stillness of the street, the air seemed to hold its breath, as if testing whether London had learned anything at all. Forgetting had always been the city's defense mechanism, but the Great Smog had left its fingerprints everywhere, in lungs, in stone, in silence. And though the years marched forward and the chimneys burned cleaner, the air remained a quiet witness. London could whitewash its buildings and rewrite its stories, but it could never truly forget the week when its own breath turned against it. As the years passed, the Great Smog became less an event and more a whisper, something half remembered, half denied. But those who had lived through it carried the memory in their lungs, in their dreams, in the faint rasp that never quite left their throats. They were the witnesses, the city's unwilling chroniclers, and long after Parliament congratulated itself and the newspapers turned to brighter headlines, the survivors kept talking. Their stories were not shouted from podiums but murmured across kitchen tables, in pubs, and in hospital waiting rooms. Each retelling was an act of defiance, proof that the fog had not erased them, too. One of them was Thomas Hargreaves, once a milkman in the East End. He had been 24 during the Great Smog, walking his route when the world disappeared. "It weren't fog?" he would say to anyone who asked. "Fog, don't burn your eyes or make your horse fall down dead." In the years that followed, Thomas would cough mid-sentence, apologizing between words. "Took me an hour to go one street that week," he'd tell his grandson. "Couldn't see my own hand, couldn't even find the door to knock." The boy would nod, wide-eyed, unable to imagine such blindness. To him, the city was neon and glass, its skies pale blue and harmless. But to Thomas, every mist that rolled in was a warning. Others spoke of loss more directly. Ellen Cripps, widowed by the smog, never left her street again. Her husband had gone out to fetch bread and never returned. She found him 2 days later at the corner, seated upright against a wall, as though resting. The doctor called it heart failure induced by exposure. Ellen called it murder by air. In her later years, she sat by her window when the fog returned, her breathing shallow but steady. "It's never really gone," she'd whisper. "It's just waiting for us to forget." Doctors, too, carried the memories. Some could never again light their pipes. The smell reminded them of death. Others spent their remaining careers lecturing about pollution, their voices trembling not with age, but with frustration that it had taken so much death to make people listen. They wrote papers no one read, testified before committees that had already decided their conclusions. But they kept speaking, because silence had been the fog's most faithful ally. In schools, the children of survivors listened to the stories with disbelief. The Great Smog had become mythic, a tale of an ancient, darker London. Teachers spoke of it as history, a chapter neatly closed. Yet in old neighborhoods like Bermondsey and Poplar, the air still carried the faint tang of coal, and the old men would shake their heads when the weather turned still. "It comes back quiet," they'd mutter, watching the haze gather over the rooftops. The survivors' voices never reached Parliament again, but they lingered where it mattered most, in conversation, in breath, in memory. They spoke softly, as though afraid to disturb the air, but their words endured. "We thought the city was invincible," Thomas once said before his final coughing fit. "Turns out, it was just human like the rest of us." And that, perhaps, was the truest thing ever said about London, that its strength lay not in smoke or empire, but in the frail persistence of those who had lived long enough to remember the day the sky itself had failed. For those who had lived through it, the Great Smog never truly ended. Long after the skies cleared and the city learned to breathe again, it came back in the quiet hours, not through the streets, but through sleep. The survivors carried it within them, a haze that rose when their minds drifted too far into memory. They dreamed of yellow air thick enough to touch, of footsteps vanishing beside them, of voices swallowed mid-sentence. They woke coughing, clutching their throats, convinced the air had turned solid once more. In the first decades after the disaster, doctors began to speak of it as a kind of lingering wound, smog trauma, some called it, though no such diagnosis existed. Men and women who had survived the week of suffocation reported strange ailments, shortness of breath on still nights, dizziness when fog rolled over the Thames, sudden bursts of panic at the smell of coal smoke. Others described a heaviness that came without warning, as though the air itself remembered how to press upon them. "You never forget not breathing," one woman wrote in her diary. "It hides in you, waiting." The dreams were the worst. In one recurring vision, a retired nurse from Guy's Hospital found herself walking the wards again. The lamps flickered, the air thickened, and the patients she had once tended began to vanish one by one, not dying but dissolving into the haze until she was alone, her own hands fading before her eyes. She always woke gasping. "It's not fear," she told her doctor. "It's recognition." Another man, a former bus driver, dreamed of endless streets with no passengers, his route lost in fog, his own headlights reflecting only himself. Each night he tried to turn the bus around, and each night the road simply ended. For the city as a whole, the smog had become a ghost story, a cautionary tale told to schoolchildren on grey mornings. Teachers would describe the week when London disappeared, and the children would shiver in delight, unable to imagine air that could kill. But for the old, the story was not a memory, it was a haunting. They saw it everywhere, in the steam rising from grates, in the smoke of a match, in the mist that gathered along the river. Some avoided December altogether, leaving the city for the countryside as if fleeing a ghost that kept the same anniversary each year. Psychologists, new to the field of mass trauma, began studying these fog dreams. They found that they did not fade with age. The older the survivor, the more vivid the visions became. The mind, it seemed, did not distinguish between the air one had breathed and the air one had feared. Even the city dreamed. On cold mornings, when the fog rolled low over the Thames, London seemed to remember itself a soft echo of those 5 terrible days. The street lamps glowed faintly, the air stilled, and for a heartbeat, it was as though the past exhaled. The people who noticed it looked up, uneasy, and whispered that the smog had returned. But it was only the memory of it, the city's own restless dream, forever caught between breath and silence. Decades later, when the last of the survivors had grown old and grey, London finally began to speak of the Great Smog with reverence instead of embarrassment. What had once been whispered about behind closed doors became the subject of documentaries, museum exhibits, and classrooms. Photographs long hidden in archives resurfaced images of policemen vanishing into yellow air, of carriages stranded mid-street, of faces half erased by soot. Children studied them in silence, unable to believe that the same sky above their playgrounds had once been capable of murder. The city was different now. The skyline glittered with glass towers that reflected clouds instead of absorbing them. The chimneys were gone, their bricks reclaimed by ivy or converted into monuments. Electric trains hummed where the coal engines once screamed. Even the Thames, that long grey mirror, flowed clearer than anyone could remember. But on certain winter mornings, when mist clung low to the bridges and the air felt strangely heavy, Londoners still fell quiet. The silence was instinctive, an inherited caution, a memory carried through generations. In Parliament, the Great Smog was remembered not for its horror, but for what it forced the world to become. The Clean Air Act of 1956 had been the beginning of a global awakening, the first time a nation had declared that the right to breathe clean air was as sacred as the right to vote or to live in safety. The law had saved more lives than anyone could ever count. It had changed how cities burned, how industries worked, how governments measured progress, and all of it began with those 5 days of suffocation. The dead had become unwilling architects of the modern world. Every December, a small service was held at St. Paul's Cathedral. Few attended in the early years, but as the decades passed, the pews began to fill not with mourners, but with descendants. They came with photographs, with stories told by grandparents, with a quiet gratitude they could not quite articulate. The choir sang softly beneath the great dome, and when the final hymn ended, no one spoke for a long time. Outside, the air was cold and clean. Bells rang clear, unmuted for the first time in living memory. No memorial could hold all that was lost. The fog had taken children, workers, mothers, lovers, thousands whose names had faded from records but not from the city's pulse. They had given London its most fragile gift, humility. The belief that human brilliance must be matched with care, that progress without compassion was only another kind of darkness. As twilight fell over the Thames, the lights along the embankment flickered to life, their glow sharp and steady through the clear air. The river caught their reflection and carried it downstream like a chain of tiny suns. Somewhere beneath that water still slept the soot of another century, the ashes of fires that once devoured the sky. But above it, London breathed, freely, each exhale a tribute to those who could not. And though few said it aloud, everyone who stopped to watch the light shimmer across the water understood the truth the city now lived by, that every breath was borrowed and owed to the dead who had taught the living how to value the invisible gift between them and the stars.